The blood on her hands had long since dried by the time Eleanor Hayes crawled into the stable that cold October night in 1876, collapsing into a pile of hay with nothing but the clothes on her back, and a heart full of grief that threatened to consume her entirely. She had been running for 3 days straight, ever since she watched her father take his last breath on the floor of their Kansas homestead, a victim of the fever that had swept through their small farming community like wildfire. With no other family and creditors already circling their property like vultures, Eleanor had taken what little money remained hidden beneath the floorboards and fled westward, hoping to disappear into the vast expanse of Colorado territory before anyone could claim her as an indentured servant to pay off her father's debts. The practice was not uncommon, and as a 22-year-old woman alone in the world, she knew she would be considered property before she would be considered a person with rights. The town of Silverbrook was barely more than a collection of weathered buildings clustered along a muddy main street, but it had a stable, and that stable had warm hay and horses that generated heat, and that was more than Eleanor had enjoyed in days. She had slipped in after dark, moving quietly past the dozing animals until she found a corner stall that looked unused. The hay was clean and plentiful, and she burrowed into it like a wounded animal seeking shelter, finally allowing exhaustion to overtake her vigilance. She did not know how many hours had passed when the sound of boots on wooden planks jolted her awake. Pale morning light filtered through gaps in the stable walls, and Eleanor held her breath, pressing herself deeper into the hay, praying whoever had entered would not notice the suspicious lump in the corner stall. "Easy now, Artemis," a male voice said, low and soothing. "Let me check that hoof." Eleanor remained frozen as the man moved through the stable, speaking quietly to each horse in turn. His voice held a quality she had not heard in a long time, something gentle and patient that made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. She heard him moving closer, and then the stall door beside her hiding place creaked open. "Well now," the voice said, much closer than before, "I do not recall bedding down a person last night." Eleanor's eyes flew open to find a man crouched at the entrance to her stall, one hand resting on the wooden gate. He was perhaps 26 or 27, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that needed cutting. His eyes were a startling shade of gray, like storm clouds over the prairie, and they studied her with curiosity rather than anger. "I am sorry," Eleanor stammered, scrambling upright and sending hay cascading off her rumpled dress. "I will leave. I just needed somewhere warm for the night." "I have no money to pay you, but I can work. I can muck stalls or groom horses or whatever you need." The man held up a hand, his expression thoughtful. "Hold on now. Nobody said anything about leaving or paying." He tilted his head, his gray eyes narrowing slightly. "When did you last eat?" The question was so unexpected that Eleanor could only stare at him. Her stomach chose that moment to answer for her, growling loudly in the quiet stable. A slight smile tugged at the corner of the man's mouth. "Right then. Come on up to the house. My sister makes enough breakfast to feed half the territory, and there is always extra." "I could not impose," Eleanor said quickly, even as her treacherous stomach growled again. "It is not imposing if I am inviting you," the man replied. He straightened and extended his hand. "Name is James Cartwright. I run this stable and the small ranch attached to it." Eleanor hesitated, then placed her hand in his. His grip was warm and calloused, the hand of someone who worked hard for his living. "Eleanor Hayes." "Well, Miss Hayes, let us get some food into you, and then you can tell me your story if you have a mind to." James pulled her gently to her feet, his eyes sweeping over her disheveled appearance with concern rather than judgment. "You look like you have been through something fierce." Eleanor followed James out of the stable and across a small yard to a modest house built of rough-hewn logs. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the smell of frying bacon made her knees weak with hunger. James pushed open the door and gestured for her to enter ahead of him. The interior was simple but clean, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall and a wooden table surrounded by mismatched chairs in the center of the room. A young woman stood at the stove, her blonde hair pulled back in a practical braid. She turned at their entrance, her blue eyes widening in surprise. "James, who is this?" "This is Miss Eleanor Hayes," James said, moving to pour water into a basin. "She spent the night in the stable." "Eleanor, this is my sister, Catherine." Catherine's surprise quickly transformed into concern. "Oh, you poor thing. Come sit down immediately." She pulled out a chair and practically pushed Eleanor into it. "James, get her some water. Miss Hayes, do you take coffee?" "I do, but please, you do not have to go to any trouble," Eleanor protested weakly. "Nonsense," Catherine said briskly, already pouring a cup of steaming coffee. "Anyone sleeping in our stable clearly needs help, and we are not the kind of people who turn away those in need." She set the coffee in front of Eleanor, then returned to the stove to dish up a plate piled high with eggs, bacon, and thick slices of bread. Eleanor's eyes stung with unexpected tears at the simple kindness. She wrapped her hands around the warm coffee cup and took a careful sip, letting the heat spread through her chest. James sat down across from her, his gray eyes watchful. "You do not have to tell us anything you do not want to," he said quietly. "But if you are in some kind of trouble, maybe we can help." Eleanor looked between James and Catherine, seeing nothing but genuine concern in their faces. Something in her chest cracked open, and the words spilled out before she could stop them. She told them about her father's death, about the debts and the creditors, about fleeing in the night with nothing but fear driving her westward. She did not cry as she spoke, having exhausted her tears days ago, but her voice shook with the weight of everything she had lost. When she finished, silence filled the kitchen. Catherine had sat down at some point during the story, her hand pressed to her mouth. James was very still, his expression unreadable. "Those bastards," Catherine finally said, her voice tight with anger. "Pardon my language, but that is what they are. You cannot sell a person to pay debts. That is not legal." "It happens anyway," Eleanor said tiredly. "Especially to women with no family to protect them. I have heard stories. Once they get you signed to a contract as a housekeeper or servant, they can make it last years. And if you try to leave, they call you a thief and have you arrested." James leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight. "That will not happen to you here. Kansas is far enough away that I doubt anyone will track you this far, but even if they do, they will have to go through me first." Eleanor looked at him in surprise. "Why would you do that? You do not even know me." "Because it is the right thing to do," James said simply, "and because I have some experience with people who think they can treat others as property." His voice had gone hard, and Catherine reached over to briefly squeeze his arm. "Our mother was Arapaho," Catherine explained quietly. "We grew up on the reservation until our father, who was white, brought us out here when things got bad. We know what it is like to be treated as less than human." Eleanor's throat tightened again. "I am sorry, that must have been terrible," James shook his head. "It made us who we are, and it taught us to help others when we can." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the stable. "You said you could work with horses." "I grew up on a farm," Eleanor said. "We had draft horses and a few riding horses. I know how to care for them, though I am no expert." "Do not need an expert," James said, turning back to face her. "I need someone reliable who will not spook the animals and who can handle the basic work. Catherine helps when she can, but she has her own work with the garden and the house and taking in sewing from the townspeople. I have been managing alone, but I could use the help." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I can offer you room and board plus a small wage. Nothing fancy, but it would give you a place to stay and some money to save." "Room and board," Eleanor repeated. "But where would I stay? I cannot continue sleeping in the stable." "Of course not," Catherine said firmly. "You will take James's room. He can sleep out in the stable or make up a bedroll near the fireplace." "Absolutely not," Eleanor protested, standing so quickly her chair scraped against the floor. "I will not displace you from your own bed. The stable is fine, it is warm and dry, and I have no right to ask for more." "You are not asking, I am offering," James said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The stable is no place for a lady to sleep, Miss Hayes. You will take my room and I will make other arrangements. It is not up for debate." Eleanor opened her mouth to argue further, but something in James's expression stopped her. There was a quiet determination in his gray eyes, a firmness that spoke of a man who had made up his mind and would not be swayed. It was not arrogance or dominance, but rather a deep-seated conviction about what was right. "I will earn it," Eleanor said finally. "Whatever wages you are going to pay me, keep them until it equals what the room is worth. I will not be a charity case." A flicker of respect crossed James's face. "Fair enough, though the room does not cost me anything, so you will find yourself with wages sooner than you think." He extended his hand again. "Do we have an agreement, Miss Hayes?" Eleanor shook his hand, feeling the warmth and strength in his grip. "We do, Mr. Cartwright, and thank you." Truly? That first day set the pattern for the days that followed. James showed Eleanor around the stable, introducing her to each of the dozen horses in his care. There was Artemis, his own buckskin mare with a white star on her forehead. There was Thunder, a massive black gelding belonging to the town blacksmith. There were several riding horses boarded by wealthy townspeople, and a few young horses James was training for sale. Eleanor threw herself into the work with desperate gratitude. She mucked stalls, hauled water, brushed coats until they gleamed, and checked hooves for stones or injuries. The work was hard and left her muscles aching by the end of each day, but it was honest work, and it kept her mind occupied so she could not dwell on her grief. James worked alongside her, and Eleanor quickly came to appreciate his quiet competence. He moved through the stable with an easy confidence, speaking to the horses in that low, gentle voice that seemed to calm even the most skittish animals. He was patient with Eleanor when she made mistakes, showing her the proper way to approach a nervous horse or how to tell when a saddle was fitted correctly. "You have a good hand with them," James observed one afternoon about a week after Eleanor's arrival. They were grooming the horses together, working in the comfortable silence that had developed between them. Thunder usually does not let anyone but his owner near him, but he is calm as can be with you. Eleanor looked at the big black gelding, who was indeed standing placidly as she brushed his neck. "I think animals can sense when you mean them no harm. My father always said horses were better judges of character than most people." "Your father sounds like he was a wise man," James said quietly. "He was," Eleanor replied, her hands stilling on Thunder's coat. "He did his best after my mother died. That was 10 years ago when I was 12. He taught me everything about running a farm, even though most people said I should be learning to sew and cook instead." "Did you learn to sew and cook?" James asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Enough to get by, but I was always happier working outside with the animals." Eleanor resumed brushing, focusing on the rhythmic motion. "I suppose that makes me strange." "That makes you useful," James corrected. "And there is nothing strange about knowing your own mind and what makes you happy." Eleanor glanced at him, finding him watching her with those thoughtful gray eyes. There was no judgment in his gaze, only acceptance, and something warm unfurled in her chest. The nights were harder than the days. James had insisted on giving Eleanor his room, which was small but comfortable, with a real bed and a window that looked out over the prairie. He had moved his belongings out without complaint, making up a bedroll near the fireplace in the main room. Eleanor had protested again, but both James and Catherine had been immovable on the subject. "It is not proper for you to sleep in the stable or on the floor," Catherine had said firmly. "You are a young woman alone, and you deserve privacy and safety. James does not mind. He has slept in far worse places, believe me." So Eleanor had reluctantly accepted the room, though guilt gnawed at her every night when she climbed into the soft bed while James made do with blankets on the floor. She lay awake those first nights, listening to the sounds of the house settling and the distant howl of coyotes on the prairie, thinking about everything that had happened and everything she had lost. But as the days turned into weeks, something began to shift inside her. The sharp edge of her grief dulled slightly, not disappearing but becoming something she could carry without it consuming her every thought. She found herself smiling at Catherine's stories over breakfast, laughing when one of the young horses tried to steal her hat, feeling almost peaceful in the quiet evening hours when the work was done and they all sat around the fire. And she found herself increasingly aware of James. It started small, noticing the way he moved with unconscious grace, the way his hands were always gentle with the animals, the way his rare smiles transformed his serious face into something almost boyish. She noticed how he always checked to make sure she had eaten enough at meals, how he positioned himself between her and any strangers who came to the stable, how he listened when she spoke, as though her words truly mattered. Eleanor tried to ignore the growing warmth in her chest whenever James was near. She had no business developing feelings for her employer, especially when he had shown her nothing but kindness and respect. He had given her shelter and work when she had nothing, and the last thing she wanted was to make him uncomfortable with unwanted affection. But ignoring her feelings proved impossible, especially during the long hours they spent working side by side in the stable. One particularly cold November morning, about 6 weeks after Eleanor's arrival, she was struggling to lift a heavy saddle onto its stand when James appeared at her elbow. "Here, let me help with that," he said, reaching for the saddle. Eleanor stubbornly kept her grip. "I can manage it." "I know you can," James replied patiently, "but there is no shame in accepting help when something is heavy." They stood there for a moment, both holding the saddle, close enough that Eleanor could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the chilly stable. She could smell leather and hay and something else, something distinctly James that made her heart beat faster. "Why are you so kind?" The question escaped before Eleanor could stop it. She immediately wanted to take it back, but James did not seem offended. Instead, he carefully set the saddle on its stand, then turned to face her fully. "What do you mean?" Eleanor gestured helplessly. "You took in a complete stranger. You gave me your bed and your floor. You pay me wages and never complain about mistakes I make. You treat me like I matter. Why?" James was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face. "My mother used to say that kindness is not something you give because someone deserves it. It is something you give because you are capable of it." He paused, then added more quietly, "And you do matter, Eleanor. You matter a great deal." The way he said her name, dropping the formal Miss Hayes for the first time, made Eleanor's breath catch. There was something in his eyes, something warm and intense that made her wonder if perhaps she was not alone in her growing feelings. But before she could find the courage to say anything, the stable door banged open and a young boy rushed in, his face flushed with cold and excitement. "Mr. Cartwright, my pa says, can you come quick? One of our mares is foaling and something is wrong." The moment shattered. James was already moving, grabbing his coat and a bag of supplies he kept for emergencies. "Which mare, Tommy? The bay or the gray?" "The gray one, sir. She has been laboring since last night, but the foal will not come." James swore under his breath, then glanced at Eleanor. "I need to go." "Can you manage things here?" "Of course," Eleanor said immediately. "Go, do what you need to do." James hesitated, then reached out and briefly squeezed her hand. "I will be back as soon as I can." Then he was gone, following young Tommy out into the cold morning. Eleanor stood in the empty stable, her hand still tingling from his touch, her heart pounding in her chest. Catherine found her there a few minutes later, staring at nothing in particular. "He will be fine," Catherine said gently, misunderstanding Eleanor's expression. "James is very good with difficult births. He has helped many horses through troubled foaling." "I am sure he is," Eleanor said, shaking herself out of her reverie. "I should get back to work," but Catherine caught her arm as she tried to walk past. "Eleanor, wait. Can I speak with you for a moment?" Something in Catherine's tone made Eleanor's stomach tighten with apprehension. "Of course. What is it?" Catherine bit her lip, seeming to struggle with her words. "I hope you will not think I am overstepping, but I have noticed something these past weeks. The way you look at my brother and the way he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching." Heat flooded Eleanor's face. Catherine, I would never, I do not want to make anyone uncomfortable. If I have done something inappropriate— No, no, Catherine interrupted quickly. That is not what I meant at all. Eleanor, I am happy about it, more than happy. I have not seen James smile this much in years. Eleanor stared at her. What are you saying? Catherine took both of Eleanor's hands in hers. I am saying that I think my brother cares for you. Truly cares for you in a way that goes beyond employer and employee or even friendship. And I think, perhaps, you might feel the same way about him. I do, Eleanor whispered, the admission escaping before she could think better of it. God help me, Catherine, I do. But I have no right to those feelings. He saved me. He gave me everything when I had nothing. How can I repay that kindness by complicating his life with my affections? Love is not a complication, Catherine said softly. It is a gift. And Eleanor, you should know something about James. He does not let people close easily. After everything we went through growing up after losing our parents, he built walls around his heart. But somehow you walked right through those walls without even trying. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. What if I am wrong? What if I am seeing things that are not there because I want them to be? You are not wrong, Catherine assured her. But if you need proof, watch how he is with you when he returns. Really watch him. See how he looks at you, how he speaks to you, how he always makes sure you are safe and comfortable. She smiled gently. My brother is not a man of flowery words, Eleanor. He shows his feelings through his actions, and his actions toward you speak very clearly. James did not return until late that afternoon. Eleanor heard his footsteps on the porch and rushed to open the door before he could knock. He stood there looking exhausted, his clothes dirty and his hair disheveled, but his eyes brightened when he saw her. How did it go? Eleanor asked quickly. Is the mare all right? The foal? Both fine, James said, stepping inside and gratefully accepting the cup of coffee Catherine pressed into his hands. The foal was positioned wrong, but we managed to turn it. A healthy colt, and the mare is already on her feet. You must be exhausted, Eleanor said, resisting the urge to reach up and smooth his rumpled hair. Sit down. I kept dinner warm for you. James sank into a chair with a grateful sigh. As Eleanor busied herself dishing up a plate of stew and fresh bread, she felt his eyes following her around the kitchen. When she set the food in front of him, their fingers brushed and his hand lingered, his thumb grazing across her knuckles in a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. Thank you, he said quietly, his gray eyes holding hers, for managing everything while I was gone and for waiting up for me. Always, Eleanor replied, then flushed at how revealing the single word sounded, but James only smiled, that rare, warm smile that transformed his whole face. Always, he repeated softly, as though sealing a promise. Catherine caught Eleanor's eye from across the room and gave her a knowing look that clearly said, see, that night, as Eleanor lay in James's bed, she allowed herself to hope. Hope that perhaps Catherine was right, that perhaps the feelings growing in her heart were not one-sided. Hope that maybe, despite everything she had lost, she might have found something precious here in this small Colorado town with a kind cowboy who gave up his bed without hesitation and treated her like she mattered. The next morning dawned bright and cold, with frost coating every surface in delicate white crystals. Eleanor woke early, as had become her habit, and dressed quickly in the simple work dress Catherine had given her. Her own dress had been so worn and dirty that Catherine had insisted on altering one of her old dresses to fit Eleanor instead. She found James already in the stable, forking fresh hay into the stalls. He looked up when she entered, his breath misting in the cold air. Morning, he greeted her, his voice still rough with sleep. Thought I would get an early start. One of the mares is due to foal soon, and I want to keep a close eye on her. Which one? Eleanor asked, moving to help him distribute the hay. Dahlia, the chestnut in the end stall. She is one of mine, and this is her first foal. I am a bit nervous about it, James admitted. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, moving through the familiar morning routine. Eleanor had learned the rhythm of stable work over the past weeks, and she and James moved around each other with easy coordination, each anticipating what needed to be done next. "Eleanor," James said suddenly, breaking the silence, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," Eleanor replied, pausing in her work. James leaned on his pitchfork, his expression serious. "Do you ever think about going back, to Kansas, I mean, once enough time has passed that the creditors have given up looking for you?" The question caught Eleanor off guard. "I do not know," she said slowly. "I have not let myself think that far ahead. Why do you ask?" "Because I need to know if you are planning to stay," James said, his gray eyes intense. "Not just for the work, but because I need to know if you are going to be here. If this is temporary for you, or if maybe you could see yourself building a life here." Eleanor's heart began to pound. "James, I do not understand. Why does it matter?" James set down his pitchfork and crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides. He stopped just in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to look up at him. "It matters because I am falling in love with you," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "Hell, I think I have been falling since the day I found you in that stall, looking fierce and frightened all at once. It matters because the thought of you leaving makes my chest tight with panic. It matters because every day I give up that bed is a privilege, not a sacrifice, if it means you are safe and comfortable under my roof." Eleanor could not breathe, could not think, could only stare up at James's face and see the truth of his words written in every line, in the vulnerability in his eyes, in the slight tremor in his hands as he reached up to gently cup her face. "I know I have no right to feel this way," James continued, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone with heartbreaking tenderness. "You came here looking for safety, not for some cowboy to complicate your life with his feelings. If this is unwelcome, tell me now and I swear I will never mention it again. We will go back to how things were, and I will be content to just have you in my life in whatever capacity you allow." "James," Eleanor whispered, her own hands coming up to rest on his chest. She could feel his heart pounding beneath her palms as wild and fast as her own. "You beautiful, ridiculous man, how could this possibly be unwelcome?" Hope flared in James's eyes. "Eleanor, I love you too," Eleanor said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I have been trying not to because I thought it would be improper, that I would be taking advantage of your kindness. But Catherine made me see that maybe, just maybe, you might feel the same way. And now you have said it, and James, I do not ever want to leave. This place, this life, you have become everything to me." For a moment, James just stared at her as though he could not quite believe what he was hearing. Then a smile spread across his face, brilliant and joyful, and he pulled her into his arms. Eleanor went willingly, wrapping her arms around his waist and pressing her face against his chest. "Say it again," James murmured into her hair. "Please?" "I love you," Eleanor said, the words muffled against his shirt. She pulled back just enough to look up at him. "I love you, James Cartwright. I love your kindness and your patience and the way you talk to horses. I love how you gave me your bed without a second thought and how you make me feel safe and valued. I love you." James made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and then he was kissing her. His lips were warm and gentle, moving against hers with a tenderness that made Eleanor's knees weak. She clutched at his shoulders, kissing him back with all the emotion that had been building inside her for weeks. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, James rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know it is fast, and I know we have only known each other a few months, but Eleanor, I am certain, I have never been more certain of anything in my life. Marry me." Eleanor laughed, the sound bright with joy. "Yes, yes, of course yes." James kissed her again, harder this time, his arms tightening around her as though he would never let her go. Eleanor lost herself in the kiss, in the warmth of his embrace, in the overwhelming joy of being loved and being able to love in return. A pointed cough from the stable door made them spring apart. Catherine stood there, her arms crossed and a huge grin on her face. "Well, it is about time," she said. I was beginning to think I would have to lock you two in a stall together until you figured it out. James laughed, his arm still around Eleanor's waist. How long have you been standing there? Long enough to hear a marriage proposal and acceptance, Catherine said, rushing forward to embrace Eleanor. Oh, I am so happy. Welcome to the family, Eleanor, officially this time. The next few weeks passed in a blur of happiness and preparation. They decided to wait until spring to marry, wanting to give Eleanor time to truly settle into her new life, and to allow James to save enough money for a proper celebration. But the delay did nothing to diminish their joy in each other. They continued to work side by side in the stable, but now their hands found excuses to touch, their glances lingered. Their conversations stretched late into the night as they sat by the fire and talked about their dreams for the future. James still insisted on Eleanor keeping his room, though he kissed her goodnight at the door each evening with a tenderness that made her heart ache. I want to do this properly, he said one night, when Eleanor had suggested perhaps the waiting was unnecessary. You deserve to be courted and respected, and when we finally do share a bed, I want it to be as my wife. Eleanor could not argue with that, though she lay awake many nights aching for more than just goodnight kisses. Winter settled over Silverbrook in earnest, bringing snow that piled in deep drifts and temperatures that made even the stable feel frigid. James and Eleanor worked extra hard to keep the horses comfortable, adding extra hay for warmth and breaking ice off the water troughs multiple times a day. One particularly brutal evening in late January of 1877, a stranger rode into town on a horse that was lathered and shaking with exhaustion. Eleanor was in the stable checking on the horses one final time before heading in for the night when the man burst through the door. Need a place for my horse, he demanded, his voice sharp and impatient. Now, Eleanor straightened, taking in the man's fine clothes and expensive saddle. Of course, sir, let me take him. You have ridden him hard in this weather. That is none of your concern, the man snapped. Just take care of him. I am staying at the boarding house and I will be back in the morning. He thrust the reins at Eleanor and stormed out without another word. Eleanor stared after him, then looked at the trembling horse. The poor animal was in bad shape, his coat soaked with sweat despite the freezing temperature, his sides heaving with labored breaths. You poor thing, Eleanor murmured, leading him gently into an empty stall. Let us get you taken care of. She spent the next hour carefully cooling the horse down, walking him slowly until his breathing calmed, then rubbing him down with dry cloths and covering him with a warm blanket. She gave him small amounts of water and a generous portion of hay, then stayed with him to make sure he did not develop any complications from being ridden so hard in such cold weather. James found her there an hour later, sitting on an overturned bucket outside the stall, watching the horse eat. I saw the new arrival, James said, crouching down beside her. The owner seemed like a pleasant fellow. Eleanor snorted. If by pleasant you mean rude and careless, then yes. He nearly killed this horse riding him that hard in this cold. What kind of person does that? The kind who does not care about anything except his own convenience, James said grimly. He studied the horse, then nodded approvingly. You did good work with him. He looks much better already. I could not just put him in a stall and leave him, Eleanor said. He needed care. James reached over and took her hand, lacing their fingers together. This is one of the many reasons I love you, your compassionate heart. Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder, tired but content. Remind me that I married a man who appreciates long hours in a cold stable. We'll marry, James corrected with a smile. 3 more months, Eleanor, then you will be stuck with me forever. I cannot wait, Eleanor said softly. The stranger proved to be just as unpleasant the next morning as he had been the night before. He showed up early, demanding his horse immediately and complaining about the boarding fee despite it being more than reasonable. Your horse needed extensive care last night due to being overworked, Eleanor said firmly, meeting the man's glare without flinching. The fee reflects that care. If you do not wish to pay boarding fees in the future, I suggest you treat your animal with more consideration. The man's face reddened with anger. "How dare you speak to me that way? Do you know who I am? I am Marcus Thornton from Kansas. I own property and businesses. I do not need some stable girl lecturing me about horse care." Eleanor felt as though she had been doused with ice water. Kansas. This man was from Kansas. She forced herself to remain calm, to not react to the mention of her former home. "Regardless of who you are, sir, the fee remains the same," she said evenly. Marcus Thornton studied her with narrowed eyes, and Eleanor saw the exact moment recognition began to dawn. His eyes widened slightly and a cruel smile curved his lips. "Wait a moment, I know you. You are that Hayes girl, the one who ran off when her father died and left all those debts unpaid." Eleanor's blood ran cold. Before she could respond, James appeared at her side, his presence solid and reassuring. "Is there a problem here?" James asked, his voice deceptively mild. Thornton looked James up and down dismissively. "This girl owes money back in Kansas, substantial money. Her father died in debt, and according to our laws, those debts transfer to his heir. That would be her." "Colorado territory does not recognize debt transfer laws," James said calmly. "Miss Hayes owes you nothing. She stole money that was rightfully owed to creditors," Thornton snarled. "That makes her a thief. I could have her arrested. On what grounds?" James took a step forward, and though he was not a particularly large man, there was something in his bearing that made Thornton take an involuntary step back. "Do you have proof this debt exists? Do you have legal documentation signed by a judge? Because if you do not, then you are just a man making baseless accusations against an innocent woman, and I do not take kindly to that." Thornton's face was mottled with rage. "This is not over. When I get back to Kansas, I will file the proper paperwork. And then I will return with a marshal, and your little thief will face justice." "You do that," James said evenly. "But until you have legal authority, Miss Hayes is under my protection. And I suggest you leave my property now, before I decide you have worn out your welcome." Thornton grabbed his horse's reins and mounted roughly, making the poor animal shy nervously. "You will regret this," he spat, then wheeled the horse around and rode off at a reckless gallop. As soon as he was out of sight, Eleanor's knees gave out. James caught her, lowering her gently to sit on a hay bale. "It is all right," he said soothingly, kneeling in front of her. "He is gone. But he will come back," Eleanor said, her voice shaking. "He will file papers and return with legal authority, and then what will I do?" "James, I cannot let you get into trouble on my account. If he comes back with a marshal, then we will deal with it," James said firmly. "Eleanor, look at me." He waited until her eyes met his. "I meant what I said. You are under my protection. I will not let anyone take you anywhere you do not want to go. But the law in Colorado territory is different from Kansas law, and even if it were not, you did nothing wrong. You fled an unjust situation. No judge worth his salt would uphold a debt transfer in these circumstances." James took both her hands in his. "We will fight this, Eleanor, together." Eleanor wanted to believe him, but fear had taken root in her chest. She spent the next few days jumping at every sound, terrified that Thornton had returned with authorities. James stayed close, clearly worried about her, and Catherine did her best to provide distraction and reassurance. "That horrid man is probably halfway back to Kansas by now," Catherine said one afternoon as she helped Eleanor mend a torn saddle blanket. "And even if he does file papers, it will take months for anything to come of it. Months you will spend as James's wife, which will provide additional legal protection." Eleanor had not thought of that. Being married would make a difference. "Of course it would," Catherine said. "You would be James's legal responsibility, not an unmarried woman alone. Any claim against you would have to go through him. And James is a property owner and respected member of this community. His word carries weight." It was a small comfort, but Eleanor clung to it. The fear gradually faded over the following weeks, particularly when no marshal appeared and no legal documents arrived. Life slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it could be with a wedding to plan. Catherine threw herself into preparations with enthusiasm. sewing Eleanor a beautiful dress of soft blue wool, and organizing a celebration at the small church in town. The townspeople, who had come to know and like Eleanor over the winter months, offered help and gifts. The blacksmith promised to shoe all of James's horses for free. The seamstress donated lace for Eleanor's dress. The woman who ran the boarding house offered to host a wedding dinner. Eleanor was overwhelmed by the generosity and acceptance. These people who owed her nothing had welcomed her as one of their own. It made her love her new home even more. As April approached and the snow began to melt, revealing the first green shoots of spring grass, Eleanor felt her happiness growing. She was going to marry the man she loved. She was going to build a life here in Silverbrook, working with horses and making a home. The fears that had plagued her after Thornton's visit faded to distant worry. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in April, a bright spring day when the prairie was just beginning to bloom. Eleanor woke that morning in James's bed for the last time, knowing that when she returned to this house that night, it would be as James's wife. And this room would truly be theirs together. Catherine helped her dress, pinning up her dark hair and settling the delicate lace veil over her face. Eleanor stared at her reflection in the small mirror, hardly recognizing the radiant woman looking back at her. Gone was the terrified, grief-stricken girl who had collapsed in the stable 6 months ago. In her place stood a woman who had found love and purpose and a place to call home. "You look beautiful," Catherine said softly, her eyes bright with tears. "James is going to forget how to breathe when he sees you." Eleanor laughed, her own eyes stinging. "Thank you, Catherine, for everything. You have been such a good friend to me." "We are sisters now," Catherine corrected, embracing her carefully to avoid crushing the dress. "Or we will be in a few hours. Come on, we do not want to keep my impatient brother waiting." The small church was packed with townspeople when Eleanor arrived. She stood at the back, her arm linked through Catherine's, since there was no father to give her away. Her heart pounded as she looked down the aisle to where James stood waiting, looking impossibly handsome in a new shirt and vest, his dark hair neatly combed. Then the small organ began to play, and Eleanor was walking forward, her eyes locked on James. She saw his expression transform as he watched her approach, saw wonder and love and joy written across his features so clearly that her own eyes filled with tears. When she reached him, James took her hands in his, and Eleanor could feel the slight tremor in his fingers. He was nervous, she realized. This strong, steady man who had faced down Marcus Thornton without flinching was nervous about marrying her. The thought made her love him even more. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. They spoke their vows in steady voices, promising to love and honor each other for all their days. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, James cupped Eleanor's face in his hands and kissed her with such tenderness that several women in the congregation sighed audibly. The celebration that followed was joyful and loud, with music and dancing and more food than Eleanor had seen in years. She and James danced together, his arms around her waist, her head resting on his shoulder, both of them swaying to the fiddle music and grinning like fools. "Happy." James murmured into her hair. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Eleanor replied honestly. She pulled back to look up at him. "Thank you for finding me in that stable. Thank you for giving me a chance at this life." "Thank you for taking that chance," James said. He kissed her forehead, then her nose, then her lips. "I love you, Eleanor Cartwright." Eleanor's heart swelled at the sound of her new name. "I love you too." They stayed at the celebration until the sun set, then finally made their way home through the spring evening. Catherine had tactfully announced she would be spending the night with a friend in town, giving them privacy for their first night as husband and wife. Inside the small house, James lit candles while Eleanor stood nervously in the center of the room. Now that they were finally alone, she felt suddenly shy. James seemed to sense her nerves because he crossed to her and took her hands gently. "We do not have to do anything you are not ready for," he said quietly. "We have all the time in the world," but Eleanor shook her head. "I am ready." "I am just a bit nervous. I do not really know what to expect." Understanding and tenderness filled James's eyes. "Then we will figure it out together, slowly. And if at any point you want to stop, you just say so, all right." Eleanor nodded, and James leaned down to kiss her, soft and sweet and patient. He led her to the bedroom, the room that had been his and was now theirs, and slowly, gently, reverently, he showed her what it meant to be loved. Later, lying in James's arms with her head on his chest and his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder, Eleanor felt a peace she had never known. This was home. This man, this life, this love. It was everything she had never known she needed. "What are you thinking?" James asked softly. "That I would sleep in 100 stables if it led me here to you," Eleanor said. "That I am the luckiest woman alive." James tightened his arms around her. "I am the lucky one. I found a treasure hidden in my stable and somehow convinced her to marry me." Eleanor tilted her head up to kiss his jaw. "You did not have to convince me. You just had to give up your bed and sleep on the floor like the gentleman you are." "Best decision I ever made," James said with a smile. They fell asleep wrapped around each other, warm and content and completely in love. The months that followed their wedding were the happiest of Eleanor's life. She and James settled into married life with ease, their days filled with the familiar rhythms of stable work and their nights with laughter, conversation, and the joy of discovering each other. Catherine continued to live with them, and the three of them became a close-knit family. Eleanor threw herself into learning everything she could about horse breeding and training. James was an excellent teacher, and he seemed to take genuine pleasure in sharing his knowledge. Together, they began to build the stable's reputation, and more customers started bringing their horses to board or train. Summer came, hot and bright, turning the prairie grass golden. Eleanor and James worked side by side through the long days, and in the evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the vast expanse of land. James's arm around Eleanor's shoulders and her head resting against his chest. It was on one such evening in late August that Eleanor realized her monthly bleeding had not come. She said nothing at first, not wanting to raise hopes until she was certain, but when another month passed with no sign and she began feeling queasy in the mornings, she knew. She told James one night in the privacy of their room, watching his face carefully for his reaction. For a moment he just stared at her, his gray eyes wide with shock. Then a grin spread across his face, so bright and joyful that Eleanor started laughing. "A baby." He said, his voice rough with emotion. "We are going to have a baby in the spring, I think," Eleanor confirmed. "Are you happy?" Instead of answering, James picked her up and spun her around, making her shriek with surprised laughter. He set her down carefully and immediately looked concerned. "I should not have done that. I could have hurt you, or the baby. Are you all right, James?" Eleanor said, touching his face gently. "I am fine, the baby is fine, and we are going to be parents." "We are going to be parents," James repeated, as though trying to make the words feel real. Then he was kissing her, pouring all his joy and love and excitement into the kiss, until Eleanor was dizzy with it. Catherine cried when they told her, then immediately began planning and fussing, declaring that she would make all the baby clothes and they would need to add on to the house to make a proper nursery. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the fall and into winter. Eleanor continued working in the stable as long as she was able, though James became increasingly protective as her belly grew. By January, he was practically treating her like spun glass, insisting she rest and refusing to let her lift anything heavy. "I am pregnant, not dying," Eleanor protested one afternoon when James bodily removed a saddle from her hands. "I know that," James said, setting the saddle aside and pulling her into his arms. "But you are carrying something precious, and I am going to take care of you both whether you like it or not." Eleanor softened, leaning into his embrace. "I do like it, even if you are being a bit overprotective." "I can live with that," James said, kissing the top of her head. Their son was born on a mild day in late March of 1878, arriving after a long but uncomplicated labor. James stayed with Eleanor the entire time, holding her hand and wiping her forehead with a cool cloth, offering encouragement even when she cursed him for putting her in this situation. When the midwife finally placed the squalling, red-faced infant in Eleanor's arms, she forgot every moment of pain and discomfort. She stared down at the tiny face, the miniature fingers that gripped her own, the dark hair that was already thick on his small head, and felt her heart expand with a love so fierce it took her breath away. "He is perfect," she whispered. "Like his mother," James said hoarsely, his eyes bright with tears as he gazed at his wife and newborn son. They named him Thomas after Eleanor's father, and he became the center of their world. James proved to be a devoted father, walking the floor with Thomas when he cried at night, changing diapers without complaint, spending hours just watching his son sleep. Eleanor would often find them together in the rocking chair by the fire, James holding Thomas against his chest and murmuring stories about horses and the prairie, and how much his mother was loved. Life settled into a new rhythm, busier and more chaotic with an infant, but no less joyful. The stable continued to thrive, and they hired a young man from town to help with the extra work so Eleanor could focus on Thomas while still contributing when she had time. Thomas grew from infant to toddler, a bright, curious child who loved the horses almost as much as his parents did. By the time he was 2 years old, he was already demanding to be taken to the stable every day, giggling with delight when James would set him on the back of one of the gentler horses and lead them around the yard. "He is going to be just like his father," Eleanor said one afternoon, watching James with Thomas in the stable. "God help us if there are 2 of them," Catherine said with a laugh. She was sitting with Eleanor on the porch, both of them shelling peas for dinner. "Though I suppose I should not complain, I do love watching James be a father. He is good at it." "He is good at everything," Eleanor said softly, her eyes still on her husband and son. Catherine glanced at her, then smiled knowingly. "Should I start sewing more baby clothes?" Eleanor's hand went instinctively to her belly, where the familiar flutter of new life had recently begun. "How did you know?" "You have that look," Catherine said. "The same one you had when you were carrying Thomas. When are you due?" "Late autumn, I think," Eleanor said. "I have not told James yet. I only just realized myself." "He will be thrilled," Catherine assured her. She was right. When Eleanor told James that evening, after Thomas was asleep and they were alone in their room, his face lit up with the same joy she remembered from the first pregnancy. "Another baby," he said, his hand splaying across her still flat stomach. "Thomas is going to be a big brother. Are you happy?" Eleanor asked, though she could see the answer in his face. "Eleanor, every day with you makes me happy. Every moment of this life we have built together. Another child is just more blessing than I ever thought I would receive." Their daughter was born in November of 1880, arriving quickly and without much fuss, as though she was impatient to join the family. She had Eleanor's dark hair and James's gray eyes, and Thomas was immediately smitten with his baby sister. They named her Sarah, after James's mother, and she proved to be a completely different child than Thomas. Where he was active and adventurous, she was calm and observant, content to sit and watch the world around her with those serious gray eyes. The years flowed by, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. Thomas grew tall and strong, with his father's quiet competence and his mother's compassionate heart. Sarah remained thoughtful and gentle, showing an early aptitude for healing injured animals that made James declare she would be a veterinarian one day. The stable prospered, becoming known throughout the region for quality care and training. James and Eleanor worked side by side as they always had, their partnership as strong in business as it was in marriage. They added on to the house twice, creating more space for their growing family and for Catherine, who showed no interest in marrying and declared herself perfectly content to be the best aunt in Colorado Territory. In the spring of 1885, when Thomas was 7 and Sarah was 4, Eleanor gave birth to their third and final child, another son they named William. He was a sweet-natured baby who rarely cried and seemed to find joy in everything, and he completed their family perfectly. Life was not without its challenges. There were hard winters when money was tight, illnesses that scared them, moments of worry and frustration. But through it all, Eleanor and James faced everything together, their love deepening with each passing year. They never heard from Marcus Thornton again. Whether he had forgotten about his threats or simply decided Eleanor was not worth the trouble, they never knew. But as years passed with no legal challenges, Eleanor finally allowed herself to believe she was truly free of her past. On their 10th wedding anniversary, James surprised Eleanor with a gift. It was a sunny April morning, exactly 10 years since they had spoken their vows, and he led her out to the stable with his hands over her eyes. "James, what are you doing?" Eleanor laughed, letting him guide her. "You will see," James said. He stopped walking and removed his hands. "All right, you can look." Eleanor opened her eyes and gasped. Standing in the stable was a beautiful mare, her coat a rich chestnut that gleamed in the morning sun with a white blaze down her face. "She is for you," James said softly. "Your own horse. I know you have been riding Artemis and some of the others, but I wanted you to have one that was just yours. I have been training her for months, working with her when you were busy with the children." Eleanor approached the mare slowly, extending her hand for the horse to sniff. The mare woofed softly and lowered her head, and Eleanor ran her fingers through the silky mane. "She is perfect," Eleanor whispered. "What is her name?" "That is up to you," James said, coming to stand beside her. "She is yours to name." Eleanor thought for a moment, then smiled. "Hope. I want to call her Hope. Because 10 years ago I had lost everything and had no hope left, and then I found you in this stable and you gave me back my hope along with your bed." James pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "I love you, Eleanor Cartwright. These 10 years have been the best of my life." "Mine too," Eleanor said, rising on her toes to kiss him, "and I look forward to 50 more." As the years continued to pass, their children grew and flourished. Thomas, at 16, was nearly as tall as his father and just as skilled with horses. He had a natural gift for training that went beyond anything James could teach, an intuitive understanding of what the animals needed. He talked about starting his own stable one day, and James encouraged him, even beginning to set aside money to help him get started. Sarah, at 13, had indeed developed the healing touch they had predicted. She spent hours caring for injured birds and helping the local doctor tend to sick animals. She was quiet like her father, but had a core of steel that reminded everyone of her mother. When she announced she wanted to study medicine, to be a real doctor and not just a helper, James and Eleanor supported her completely, even though they knew it would be difficult for a woman. William, at 10, was the peacemaker of the family, always quick with a joke or a kind word when tensions ran high. He loved the stable work, but seemed just as happy helping Catherine in the garden or reading by the fire. Eleanor sometimes worried that he did not have a clear passion like his siblings, but James assured her that William would find his way in his own time. In the spring of 1893, Thomas announced that he wanted to marry a young woman from town named Mary, the daughter of the blacksmith. She was a practical, kind girl who loved horses almost as much as Thomas did, and Eleanor gave her blessing immediately. They were married that summer in the same small church where Eleanor and James had exchanged their own vows, and Eleanor cried throughout the entire ceremony, remembering her own wedding day and marveling at how quickly the years had passed. Thomas and Mary built a small house on the far edge of James and Eleanor's property and started their own stable. It was immensely satisfying to watch her son build the life he wanted, with the woman he loved, doing work that fulfilled him. Eleanor saw so much of herself and James in the young couple, and it filled her heart with joy. Sarah left for medical school in Denver the following year. It was the hardest goodbye Eleanor had ever experienced, watching her determined daughter board the train with a trunk full of clothes and books and enough courage to take on the world. But she knew Sarah would succeed. Her daughter had too much strength and conviction to do otherwise. William discovered his passion at 15 when a traveling photographer came through Silverbrook and set up a studio. William became fascinated with the process of capturing images on film, and he convinced the photographer to teach him the basics. Soon their house was filled with photographs of horses, of the prairie, of family moments captured in black and white. It turned out William had an artist's eye, able to see beauty and meaning in ordinary moments. Eleanor was 46 years old when she realized she was slowing down. The years of hard work in the stable, the pregnancies, the simple passage of time, all of it was beginning to take its toll. Her joints ached on cold mornings, and she tired more easily than she once had. James noticed, of course. He always noticed everything about her. One evening, as they were getting ready for bed, he brought it up gently. "You do not have to work in the stable as much anymore," he said, sitting beside her on the bed and taking her hand. "Thomas is managing most of the day-to-day operations now, and we have hired hands to help with the heavy work. You have earned the right to rest, Eleanor." "I do not want to rest," Eleanor protested. "The stable is my life, same as it is yours." "The stable is part of our life," James corrected gently. "But our life is so much more than that now. Our children, our grandchildren, once Thomas and Mary start their family, this home we have built together. You do not have to prove anything to anyone, least of all me." Eleanor looked at their joined hands, his still strong and calloused despite being 51 years old, hers showing the first signs of age spots and wrinkles. "When did we get old?" she asked with a slight smile. "Gradually," James said, bringing her hand to his lips. "And I have loved every moment of it. Growing old with you has been the greatest privilege of my life, Eleanor." She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arms around her, just as he had done 1,000 times over their 22 years of marriage. "I love you," she said softly. "I loved you when you found me in that stable, terrified and alone. I loved you when you gave me your bed and took the floor without a second thought. I loved you on our wedding day and the day each of our children was born. And I love you now, even more than all those other times combined." "That is good," James said, his voice rough with emotion, "because I plan on spending the rest of my life loving you right back." They did begin to slow down after that conversation, gradually transitioning more of the stable work to Thomas and the hired hands. But they still spent time in the stable every day, unable to completely step away from the work that had brought them together. They just did it at a more leisurely pace now, with more time for sitting and watching and simply enjoying each other's company. Sarah came home from medical school with her degree and immediately set up practice in Silverbrook. She was the first female doctor in the territory, and she faced considerable skepticism and prejudice, but she won people over one patient at a time with her skill and compassion. Eleanor could not have been prouder. William moved to Denver to pursue photography professionally, sending home beautiful prints of city life that decorated the walls of the house. He was making a name for himself, getting commissioned for portraits and landscapes, living an artistic life that brought him joy. Thomas and Mary welcomed their first child in 1898, a son they named James after his grandfather. Eleanor held her first grandchild in her arms and looked at her husband, seeing her own joy and wonder reflected in his eyes. They were grandparents now, entering a new phase of life together. More grandchildren followed. Thomas and Mary had 3 children in total, 2 boys and a girl. Sarah eventually married another doctor she met in Denver, and they had twins, much to everyone's delight. William married a woman he met through his photography work, and they had a daughter who showed early signs of inheriting her father's artistic eye. The new century arrived, bringing changes to Silverbrook and to the entire country. Automobiles began to appear on the streets, though horses were still the primary mode of transportation. The town grew, adding new businesses and houses. The world was changing, becoming more modern, but some things remained constant. Eleanor and James, now in their 60s, watched the changes with interest but remained rooted in the life they had built together. Their house was frequently filled with children and grandchildren, with noise and laughter and love. The stable still operated, though it was entirely Thomas's responsibility now. Eleanor and James spent their days in quieter pursuits, tending a large garden, taking slow walks across the prairie, sitting on the porch in the evenings and watching the sun set just as they had done for decades. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren threw them a large celebration. The house and yard were packed with people, many of them customers and friends they had made over the years. There were speeches and toasts, laughter and tears, stories told about the early days of the stable and how James and Eleanor had built something lasting together. James stood and raised his glass, and the crowd fell silent to hear what he would say. 30 years ago, James began, his voice still strong despite his age, I walked into my stable and found a treasure hidden in the hay. A woman who was brave and strong and kind, who had lost everything but had not lost herself. I gave her my bed that day and took the floor, thinking I was doing her a kindness. But the truth is, Eleanor gave me far more than I ever gave her. She gave me love and partnership and a family I never dreamed I would have. She gives me a life worth living every single day. He turned to Eleanor, his gray eyes bright with emotion. Eleanor Cartwright, you are the greatest blessing I have ever received. Here is to 30 more years if the Lord allows it, and to loving you until my very last breath. Eleanor stood and went to him, tears streaming down her face. I love you, she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. I loved you then, and I love you now, and I will love you always. You saved me, James Cartwright. You gave me a home and a family and a reason to keep going when I thought I had nothing left. You are my heart. They kissed while everyone cheered, and Eleanor felt the same flutter of joy she had felt on their wedding day 3 decades earlier. Time had changed them, had added gray to their hair and lines to their faces, but it had not diminished their love. If anything, the years had made it stronger, deeper, more resilient. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and sorrows. James's sister Catherine passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 72, and they buried her in the small cemetery outside town. Eleanor's grief was profound, for Catherine had been her first friend in Silverbrook and had remained a constant presence in her life. But James held her through her tears, and they comforted each other as they had always done. Thomas took over the property completely as James's health began to decline in his early 70s. It was nothing dramatic, just the general slowing down that came with age, but James no longer had the strength for physical labor. He seemed content, though, spending his days in a rocking chair on the porch, often with a grandchild or great-grandchild on his lap, telling stories about the old days. Eleanor, now in her late 60s, stayed by his side as she had for over 40 years. They would sit together on the porch for hours, holding hands and watching the life they had built continue around them. The stable was thriving under Thomas's management. Their grandchildren were growing up strong and happy. Their children had built good lives for themselves. It was more than they had ever hoped for. One warm evening in the spring of 1911, as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, James turned to Eleanor with a soft smile. "Do you remember the first time we sat here together?" he asked. "I remember every moment we have spent together," Eleanor replied, squeezing his hand gently. "I was so nervous," James continued. "So afraid I would say or do something wrong and you would leave. I could not believe someone like you would want to stay with someone like me." "Someone like you," Eleanor repeated with a laugh. "James, you are the best man I have ever known. You saw me at my lowest point and you treated me with dignity and respect. You loved me before you even knew me. How could I not want to stay?" James lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it tenderly. "I would do it all again, every moment, every choice. It all led me to you, and that makes it all worthwhile." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, the stars beginning to appear in the vast sky above them. Around them, their family went about their evening routines, voices drifting through open windows, the familiar sounds of home. "Eleanor," James said softly. "Yes, my love, thank you for sleeping in my stable that night, for letting me give you my bed, for building this life with me. Thank you for everything." Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "Thank you for finding me, for seeing me, for loving me. You gave me everything, James. We gave each other everything," James corrected gently. And as they sat together under the emerging stars, surrounded by the evidence of their love in the form of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, in the thriving stable and the solid house and the deep roots they had planted in this Colorado soil, Eleanor knew he was right. They had saved each other that day in the stable, so many years ago. He had given her his bed and she had given him her heart, and together they had built something beautiful and lasting. They had created a legacy of love and kindness that would continue long after they were gone. It was more than enough. It was everything. James lived to see his 76th birthday, passing peacefully in his sleep on a quiet spring morning. Eleanor held his hand as he drew his last breath, whispering words of love that she knew he heard even as he slipped away. Her grief was profound, a physical ache that made breathing difficult, but it was tempered by gratitude. Gratitude for the 51 years they had shared, for every moment of joy and sorrow they had experienced together, for the beautiful life they had built. She buried him in the cemetery next to Catherine, under a simple stone that read James Cartwright, beloved husband, father, and friend. And then she returned to the home they had shared and continued living, because that was what James would have wanted. Eleanor lived for another 7 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She spent her days in the garden and on the porch, telling stories about James and their life together, making sure that future generations would know the man he had been and the love they had shared. On the morning of her 81st birthday, Eleanor passed away quietly in her sleep, in the bed that had once been James's alone and had become theirs together. Her children found her there looking peaceful, a slight smile on her weathered face, and they knew she had gone to join the man she had loved for more than half a century. They buried her next to James, under a stone that matched his, and their children stood together and remembered the love story that had begun in a stable so many years ago. They remembered a cowboy who had discovered a woman sleeping in his hay and had given her his bed without hesitation. They remembered a woman who had been broken and lost and had found hope and home in the kindness of a stranger. They remembered a love that had endured through decades, through hardship and joy, growing stronger with each passing year. The stable still stands today, run by Thomas's descendants, a testament to the life James and Eleanor built together. And sometimes, on quiet spring mornings, when the light slants through the stable doors just right, people swear they can feel a presence there, gentle and warm, like two souls who fell in love in that very place and whose love continues to bless it still. It was a love story that began with a simple act of kindness, a man giving up his bed for a stranger in need. But it grew into something far greater, something that changed lives and created a legacy that would endure for generations. It was a love that proved that sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the most unexpected places, hidden in the hay of a Colorado stable, waiting to be discovered by someone brave enough and kind enough to look. And it was a love that reminded everyone who heard the story that true love, the kind that lasts a lifetime and beyond, is built on small moments of generosity and grace, on choosing each other every single day, on giving what you have freely and accepting what is given with gratitude. James gave Eleanor his bed and took the floor. And in return, she gave him her heart and built a life with him that was rich beyond measure. It was a fair trade, the kind that both of them would make again without hesitation, because what they found together in that stable was worth more than any comfort or convenience. They found each other. They found home. They found a love that would echo through the years, inspiring their children and their children's children to love boldly, give freely, and always, always look for the treasure hidden in unexpected places. And that is how a love story should end, not with an ending at all, but with a legacy that continues, touching lives and hearts long after the lovers themselves have passed into memory and legend. The stable still stands. The story lives on. And somewhere, in a place beyond this world, a cowboy and the woman he loved are still together, still smiling, still grateful for the day they found each other in a pile of hay and decided to build forever from that simple beginning.